Sometimes in worship planning, I am amazed at how truly present the Holy Spirit is doing things that we would never have thought through and intended. And Ryan picked that opening hymn to use in worship on this, which is the Sunday closest to my 10th anniversary. And the third verse of that hymn, my former congregation sang every single week as a Gloria Patri. And so it was an interesting bracketing, because as that tune went, I'm like, why do I know this tune so well? And then we got to the third verse, I was like, oh, that's because we sang it just like the doxology every week in worship for 8 years. And so it kind of was a fun way to kind of think about what felt normal and every week to me 10 years ago when Caroline and I and 3.5 of our children made the trek from Florida to Idaho. I see that Marion Highland is here in worship. I shared this on Facebook. I'd like to share it again. When in the second interview that I did as potentially being called to be your pastor, as is done, like they have a sheet of questions they're going to ask, and they all decide who's going to ask which question. And Marion's question for me, and she was sitting right here on my Skype screen, I think, or no, we were in person for that one. And she said, could you imagine staying here for 7 years? And I sure that my answer took 6 years to give. But after the interview, I asked to have a copy of the questions so I could reflect on what were the things, that they were asking about, since this is a way to think about what a community thinks is really important. We were both in discernment. Do I want to be here? Do you want me to be here? And I looked at the question Marion was supposed to have asked, and it said, could you imagine being here for 10 years? And I said, Marion, you asked a different question. And she said, well, at the time, that felt more appropriate. Which I don't know if she was saying, I can't manage handling you for more than 7, or I don't know if we can convince you to want to be here more than 7. Maybe it was both. But either way, 7 or 10 has worked out. And it's kind of amazing for me to think about that picture that personnel used to invite you all to think about this as a day to celebrate 10 years together, and looking at what my family was 10 years ago versus what it is today is a pretty amazing thing. It is interesting because you are my family too, for me to think about what it is to look on the picture that is us 10 years later. I think about Barbara Quickstad, and I think about folks like Barbara who aren't here among us but are still in our great cloud of witnesses. I think about faces that weren't here and weren't going to be here for years and years to come 10 years ago. And I'm not sure if I want to say you're lucky or we could have used you then. But I'm always remembered when we look backwards, right? Which Israel spends a lot of time doing. When we look backwards, we have to remember, no matter what we have to say about a time we've come through, we today stand here only because of the people who got us here. Right? So Soren Kierkegaard, in his book, Fear and Trembling, it's only appropriate that I quote Kierkegaard on a 10th anniversary sermon. Fear and Trembling gets annoyed because he says this generation only wants to talk about how we go further than those who have come before us. And he uses the example of Abraham's journey to Mount Moriah. This is the journey where he is going to sacrifice his son, his only son, the fulfillment of God's covenant promise to Abraham. And Kierkegaard says, the problem with us today is we imagine that we can start at the point past generations ended, like we don't have to retake the journey they were on, right? So we receive a tradition with gratitude for those who came before us, but we also want to figure out what were they imagining, and how do we come in to that tradition to say, what next? What's the next step we want to take? And we've asked that question fairly often, I think, in the last 10 years. We even had a capital campaign called Next Step, right? And I always, in those moments, remember a favorite Faulkner. I can actually say it's the only Faulkner quote I like. He wasn't my favorite author. But there's a beautiful quote William Faulkner has that says, monuments are things we build to say, this is how far we've come. And footsteps are a thing that we make when we say, I've come this farther, and from here I take the next step, right? And there's things that we've done here over which I am proud. We renovated the sanctuary. We put a new, hopefully 75 to 125-year roof on this building at a time when we told you you weren't allowed to come. I'm proud of those moments so long as they are not monuments to things we achieved, but they are footprints to think about where we want to go next. So I have tried to make a practice at every anniversary, and even more so now, to make the day nearest August 27th a moment to look and say, where have we come from, and where are we going? To that end, I looked up the first sermon I ever preached for you. Learning session, never look up the first sermon you ever preached to somebody. So some things we're grateful to put in the past. And some things, part of that sermon actually that I loved was talking about the journey of Lewis and Clark. That Lewis and Clark set about on a journey that wasn't possible. They set about to find the all-water route to the Pacific. And as you know, but they didn't, it doesn't exist. And it's a metaphor that gets used in the church a lot because at one point they found themselves trying to canoe the Bitterroot Mountains, at which point they had to trade in their canoes for horses. And the church itself often finds itself trying to canoe the 21st century. Who is God calling us to be today, given the world we inhabit? Is a challenging question because who we were 10 years ago had some things we loved about it. We were recently in a session meeting, and we talked about the fact that we are not attempting to bring back Logos, which was our children's Wednesday night program. If you don't know this, the task force that created Logos, I started on my very first day of work. That's right, they tell a new pastor, do nothing for the first year, but listen and preach and do pastoral care. And I started a task force on my very first day. But I could see from the beginning we needed to find a way to invest in our children, that we had choir and youth group and adult studies happening on Wednesday, but absolutely nothing for children. So we set about saying, how do we want to do that? So in the session meeting on Monday, it was named that we're not going to have Logos. Not right now and maybe never again. And a couple of members who were very involved and who I owe a lifelong debt of gratitude for giving their energy to it were really sad. It was such a beautiful moment. The cook team, the Caroline's cook team, the way back when cook teams that involved Ruth and John and Hicks and Joe Gailey and Ruth Gailey, that were the predecessor to Logos on Wednesday night supper, they were fond, wonderful memories. And as someone who put a lot of actually blood and tears into those memories, I too am sad that we can sit here in this moment in time and say we're not going to do Logos on Wednesday nights for the foreseeable future. But what we're hearing from young families is they won't be able to come, or it's not a thing that they can make a priority right now with the energy loss that has been COVID, with the rampant exhaustion that is in our society. And so there's a beautiful moment in which you can say, Logos helped to get us here, and it's not going to work right now to move us forward. And so we, with blessing and gratitude, prune that off our tree. Not that we no longer love it, but that it can't keep going forward, and us lamenting what isn't is a bad use of our energy. right? And so we're going to try Family Fun Days, and we invite you to make that as intergenerational as possible. Every other Sunday, we'll stick around after this service, and we will engage intergenerationally, and we will stand up and tell you the same things are true that we told you about Logos. The more adults a child and youth learns to know and love in their church, the more likely that they will stay in a community of faith for the rest of their life. The investment is the function that we're after. The form it takes doesn't matter. So Family Fun Days and Logos are two different ways to achieve the same purpose. Part of what we do when we look back and look forward is say, as long as we're still trying to fulfill our purpose and our mission, that's what's important. Dogmatically having to do it the way we want to is the obstacle we have to overcome. My first summer here, we knew at that time that some of you were here. Some of you, this won't be the fondest memory. We used to have 3 worship services. We had a, what some described as get God and go chapel service. That was great for people who wanted to go. The Thomases are nodding their heads, diehard members of it, right? You could come worship at 8 o'clock in the chapel and then drive up to Bogus Basin and ski the rest of the day, or whatever your inclination was. And so we had a chapel service at 8. We had a larger, more traditional service at like 10, and then we had a 5 p.m. praise team contemporary service. But when I walked in, we had about 130 people, 140 people across those 3 services. And one of the first things I said was, we're going to have to get rid of some worship services. We don't know each other because we're all in our very different worship experiences. But I figured that was definitely a year 2 thing, right? Except all of a sudden there got energy on the worship team, and we started to tackle it at the end of year 1. And we decided that we were going to do a summer in which we would offer only the traditional service as one service where we'd all come together. And we would have Sunday school and then traditional worship. And on the floor of session, the motion got changed. And it was instead decided we would only do contemporary worship for the summer. This is the lead up to the part of the story I like. Later that evening, I'm at Catalpa Park because it's the park next to my kids' elementary school, and they're playing on the park. And I was on the phone on the side of the park, as people do, talking to Bonnie Lind, who has subsequently moved to Portland and moved back home and is right over there on personnel again. And she was the chair of personnel at that time. So I'm talking to Bonnie, and I said, Bonnie, I just bought a house and the church is going to die. like in full, like I wasn't being hyperbolic. This was I was convinced. I was convinced the church was going to die because the session had made a decision that made no sense and that most people were going to, with their bodies, vote against by not coming. I was like, this is a really small town. There are no other church gigs. And I just bought a house. I'm stuck. And Bonnie, I can remember it said to me, Andrew, trust the process. I have subsequently made a life vow to remind myself constantly that God is in this. So things beyond our kin are happening all around. By the way, the church did not vote to have only contemporary worship. But we did survive the summer, and we did experiment, and subsequently we did go down to a single worship service, and then we started a second one back on Wednesdays for 2 years, and then we brought that back in as First Light on Sundays, trying to be both early for chapel people and contemporary for praise band people, and it has been a fun, organic, playful attempt to figure out how can we worship as people who have very different desires about how we worship. And 10 years later, I would like to say to you all, I am grateful for your willingness to not have everything be exactly as you need it to be. because that's the only way forward. One of the other values for me as a church coming in, as a pastor coming in, I had come from a church of which I was very proud and whose colleagues I loved a lot. But one of the things that always challenged me was we believed in being what we call the centrist church, which some people would call a purple church, which means of people that are both Republicans and Democrats, or people who are both theologically conservative and people who are theologically liberal. But in that church, I always felt like the way we achieved that was by not being authentic to who we were. If we just didn't talk about anything controversial, we could all get along. And a value to me when I came here was to say, we're going to talk about those things, but we're going to try to do that in a way that allows us, all of us, to never be fully right and never be fully wrong. There are times, a lot of times, I am sure, when we don't hit that mark correctly. But I am grateful to a congregation who attempts to make space for each other here, whomever that each other is. And I think it's the only way forward for the church. I regularly find myself in places where I'm hearing shouts from one side and shouts from another side, both claiming a certain amount of purity and disdain for the other. And what I'm convinced of is that there's no way forward in that world where we can't sit in the same room and recognize that neither one of us fully grasps what the future holds. But each of us needs each other to correct our limited vision. And I'm grateful that you've been willing to walk that journey here. From the first day that I walked in here, frankly, 20, 30, 40 years before I walked in here, this building has been a place of great resource and of great burden. And very early on, in sitting with our admin and operations people, it was clear to me that we had to decide whether we wanted to stay in this building or not. For those of you who weren't here 10 years ago, you don't know that we had those conversations. Is this church capable of maintaining a 60,000 square foot building in the heart of downtown Boise as 300 people? When I came, we were claiming to be 400. But we were really 200. And it was important for us to decide if that's a value for us, then how are we going to make that work? How are we going to make that work in which it does not become the anchor around our life where we can't do vital ministry and mission because all we're doing is maintaining a building. We didn't want a monument. And we have worked hard to imagine this building as a mission resource to our larger community. And if you don't know what that means, you'll see that really easily on Monday and Tuesdays when that narthex looks like the produce section of a grocery store that has had a tornado go through it. There are many places, and in the past we have even been such a place, that would say that as holy and sacred ground, we shouldn't be using it to run a food pantry. I have heard critiques in the community when we bring outside groups in regularly to use our space that we're hardly a church anymore, which is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it is that we are a community stewarding a space and making it a resource for our entire community. Reaching out to our neighbors to say, we're here to provide you a place to do what you do well. That we are fostering an appreciation of beauty and wonder and curiosity and neighborliness with one of the resources that could otherwise be a burden on our life. And so I have said for 10 years, and I'll keep saying, I don't know if for 10 more, but I'll keep saying for as long as I'm here, what you don't understand is you are the least users. I don't know how grammatically to say that. Judy will fix me later. I don't know that you are the least users of this building. There are more people here on Monday through Saturday than there are on Sunday, and that's not a bad thing. I think the church, Big C Church, Protestant mainline church in the 21st century is way behind our curve in figuring out how to maintain buildings that aren't albatrosses, but are modes of mission beyond what we do on Sunday mornings. Just this last week, I met with personnel to look at the 2023 budget. We call that August. It sucks. And you look up numbers, you know these numbers, you understand what it is like to live in a world with 9% inflation, right? Now figure out how to do right by your employees in a world with 9% inflation, in which just to make sure that everyone who works here gets the same health care and the same buying power next year that they have had this year, we would have to increase our budget by $60,000. Which we won't be able to do, but we will wrestle with in provocative ways to find the middle tension point between not having staff who has to essentially volunteer at their jobs and not have a world where we are being realistic about how we do what we do, and that we require your generosity to do it. I'm only telling you this now. That's a spoiler alert for another month or two from now. I'm telling you this now because everyone is starting to wake up to the reality that the church is going to have to find different funding structures. And we're having a conversation right now internally that I'm hoping we can make wider, having that conversation with Ryan for what it looks like to create a fine arts 501c3 that runs this building, to help try to get the building to pay for itself, so the congregation who is but one user of that building is funding its mission and ministry and not maintenance and repairs. And I think we're out in front on that conversation, though it's a bridge we don't know how to build because there's not a lot of models. And I'm grateful for a community that 10 years ago said, yes, we're okay sharing the space we call home. Which, yes, means occasionally, if you forget to get on the calendar in time, you won't get to do your program in your church because someone else will be doing their program in our church. And that's a gift you've given and a burden you carry. And I'm grateful you've been willing to do it because I think that's the kind of foresight the church of the 21st century needs. We provide space for worship, to get food that you need to put on your table for your kids, for nonprofit boards to meet, for AA groups, there's a new group meeting here on, I won't name it because it's an anonymous group, for codependents. They have 3 of them, and Andrew usually makes a joke about, well, that's triangulation when 3 codependents get together. But I'm so grateful to know that one more group said, we've heard you give space. And that's the work of the church, even if it doesn't have the church's logo on it. One of the areas that I'm aware of and hearing and teaching, Kristen helps to reflect this back from her profession as a higher education staff, is our youth, and you know this, our youth and our children are not as a large scale okay. COVID has taken a lot away from our mental health well-being. It's not just our children and our youth, it's all of us. Statistically, 13 to 19-year-olds are 50% likely to be carrying major diagnosable trauma. And I think that if we had the stats in front of us for 5 to 13-year-olds, it would be at least the same. And we haven't figured out as a church how to be a resource in that conversation. We share a parking lot that causes a lot of angst with the high school, and we have the angst of nasty grams on car hoods of students who don't understand it's not the school's parking lot. But I'd love that instead to become a place of reparative ministry. Where is our witness to our youth that we love them and that we are a place where they can speak and have real conversations about the challenges? I'm aware as a parent and a father, uncomfortable kid moment, I get it, that I haven't been as out in front of countering cultural voices that are creating the anxiety in our children, of reminding my kids that they can choose the wrong college and their life will still be wonderful. And so I see the anxiety, and I see how I haven't been out in front of that anxiety saying, don't listen to these voices that are telling you otherwise. And I'm wondering, where is we as a church, where are we getting out in front of that conversation? Where are we using our location to reach people who will never walk in this building because they are so convinced that we are a place of hypocrisy and judgment that we're going to have to go to them? And I mean we. Not Abigail, not me, not the session, not our deacons, but where are we as a church taking on a mission to be a community that is about restoration and togetherness? Years ago, so when I fly on my own, oh man, what did I do now? Okay, when the peanut gallery that is my family starts laughing, I know I'll learn about it later. When I fly on my own, I love to watch bad movies, right? I'm a big fan of a C- movie, you know. I watch them when Caroline's falling asleep at home on my iPad or when I'm flying. There's this movie, it's like called Monster Hunters. Anyway, it's a kind of a half comedy, half adventure where big insects have taken over the world and everybody lives in these little enclaves. And it starts with this kid who's sort of ill-fitting, not very physical. He doesn't feel like he's of value to his enclave. But he sits on a radio, and these little enclaves use old ham radios to talk together. I watched this movie in the first air flight I had taken since COVID. And I got convinced that this was a beautiful movie about ecclesiology. That more than ever, what the world needs is not churches with steeples and pews, but communities dedicated to be covenantally committed to each other. I know you're wondering why in the world I chose that scripture, right? I love the beginning of it because I love you, Mom, but she has some passive-aggressive tendencies, and I love that God says, so we're going to write on these tablets again. Bring some tablets just like the ones you broke, right? That was when Moses hucked them because they had made the golden calf, right? If you're wondering about the tablets he broke, they didn't slip out of his hands, right? He returned with the tablets to a people who had made an idol out of gold, and he threw the tablets and they broke. And God is just reminding Moses, we wouldn't have to do this if you had done it right the first time. But that's the gift of covenant. Because we're doing this for the 787,000th time. And God, who knows we won't hold to our side of the bargain, is still saying, bring a tablet, just like the one you broke, and let's do this again. And I'm convinced that the world that we're headed into has got some really major issues to deal with. Increasing numbers of pandemics, questions about what is going on with our environment, whatever their cause is, it's going to be harder for us to live. Questions of overpopulation, of racial intolerance, of what it means to be in this together and who is actually us. I think we have some really, really hard conversations coming. I think life's going to get harder, not easier, and more than ever, I want us to be sitting with our ham radio, calling on each other and saying, I'm here with you to the end of the age. as God has said to us, generation after generation after generation. And so while we're living in a period where I'm asking the staff to think how we get people to come back to church, how we imagine what it means to regrow the tendons and the muscles that connect us as people rather than just the bones of what was. As we think about these conversations, we together need to be a community who has said, whatever else is true will show up tomorrow as we did yesterday. If you read the gospel, Peter gets almost nothing right. Peter has a failing grade on every pop quiz. But every day he shows up again to take the next quiz. That's the trait of discipleship. That is what it means to be a resilient enclave of togetherness. And that's what the world needs us to be. Whether you come or not, whether you like all of it or not, we're here for you. This day, tomorrow, and forever. Amen.